many people ask me if I'm going to talk about herd immunity, and of course, I'm going to talk about herd immunity. So individual vaccine choice is often portrayed as a menace to public health, and that's why we're all here to resist that assumption. And we are also, at the same time, led to believe that public health officials are guided by good reasons when they are deciding which disease they are choosing to eradicate via mass vaccination and then via state mandates. And I would like to re-examine that second assumption. And we will do that in the form of a quiz. And I would like to give you heads up that PIC will be launching an educational project which will consist of quizzes. And this is our inaugural quiz. So let's choose the right answer here. The question is, how do public health authorities gauge the importance of a disease they wish to prevent? They go by, let's do the multiple choice. They go by disease mortality rates. Who agrees with that? No. Yeah, we have a chickenpox vaccine, and obviously we can rule out A. Now, but cumulative days of sickness and disability. No, like I had common cold, taken so many days out of my life, I wish it was already eradicated. Now, let's do choice C, parental concern. No. Well, parents are now most concerned about autism, and no one is doing anything about it to prevent it or eradicate it. And we have the final, by vaccine availability. Does that sound reasonable? Wow. Okay, let's see what is the answer, because we have a hint on the next page. And this actually goes back to the 60s, when the measles eradication started. And I found these very curious quotes back from the articles published in 1962 or 1967. And the authors of these articles are not nobodies. They are high-ranking officials in the CDC at that time, Dr. Langmuir and Dr. Sensor. So how did they make the decision that it is necessary or important to eradicate measles? This is what they're saying. Dr. Langmuir says, measles, he refers to measles, is a self-limiting infection of short duration, moderate severity, and low fatality. And Dr. Sensor backs it up. The clinical measles disease is of moderate severity. Complications are infrequent, and with adequate medical care, fatalities are rare. Furthermore, he adds, by judicious use of immune globulin, and I hope you all know what it is in this audience, the damaging effects of the disease could be mitigated. Now, this is the most intriguing paragraph. The importance of any disease as a public health problem must be gauged from many angles. For example, using mortality as a criterion, heart disease becomes most important. Short-term morbidity makes common cold rank high, just like I thought. For chronic disability, arthritis and medical illness dominate. For public interest and parental concern, in spite of relatively low incidence, nothing has equaled poliomyelitis. And remember, that was back in the 60s. According to these criteria, the importance of measles cannot be compared with any of the diseases mentioned so far. So what is the need to eradicate measles? And Langmuir addresses this. To those who ask me, why do you wish to eradicate measles? I reply, because it is there and it can be done. And what gives him this confidence that it can be done? Well, this is what Sensor says, the availability of potent and effective measles vaccines. So here you have your answer. It's answer D, availability of vaccines that determines the priority for which disease to target for eradication. And in line with this kind of thinking that probably predates vaccine mandates, now we have vaccine mandates at the state level. And what are their priorities? Are they going after deadly diseases, crippling diseases such as AFM that surfaced recently in California and 34 other states? No, they don't even mention that anywhere. And instead, they go after diseases, and they're trying to implement strict and draconian measures only for diseases for which there are available vaccines. And so now we have the law, SB 27. Again, I pressed something, wrong button, is everyone here? So we have a law, SB 277, and if the compelling compelling interest of the state was indeed to prevent the spread of some important infections, my question is, does prevention of the spread of infections requires laws like SB 277 that exclude some non-contagious children from schools at all times, even in the absence of a specific disease outbreak, based on their vaccination status? What does this law achieve in terms of preventing the spread of infections? Now, obviously, SB 277 clashes with medical ethics. Does it also clash with our understanding of our modern, current understanding, up-to-date understanding of what vaccines can and cannot achieve? And this is what I would like to examine. So to answer, we need to answer these questions. So in order to meet a criteria for rational vaccine mandate, at least two criteria must be met. So the presumably deadly infection must be contagious and spread easily in a school setting. And second, the available vaccine must be capable of preventing not only the symptoms of disease, but also the transmission of infection. So let's examine the list of vaccines that is mandated by SB 277 to see if they even fit into these criteria. So let's start with hepatitis B, and I think that one is an easy answer. This disease is not easily transmissible in a school setting. We can cross that out. Let's go to the next one, DTaP or Tdap. Tetanus. Disease is not contagious. It doesn't matter that it's deadly for the purposes of our question, whether it should be mandated or not. Those considerations should be left to personal choice to estimate risks and benefits of vaccine versus disease. However, for the purposes of vaccine mandates for school attendance, the only thing matters whether it's contagious or not. Next one, let's go to diphtheria. Well, the vaccine for diphtheria is a toxoid vaccine, and what it means is that it is directed only against the diphtheria toxin to prevent the action of diphtheria toxin, but not against the diphtheria infection. So again, we can strike this out because without preventing diphtheria infection, there is no way to prevent the spread of C. diphtheria from person to person as a carrier. Finally, pertussis. Well, we know since 2013, I believe, there was an FDA study that showed that a cellular pertussis vaccine, the one that is mandated right now, failed to prevent the transmission of Bordetella pertussis infection. So the whole Tdap, DTaP combo is not fitting into the criteria of a potentially reasonable vaccine mandate. Let's go to the next one, which is IPV, which refers to inactivated polio vaccine. Everybody knows that it does not prevent transmission of polioviruses. Why everybody knows? Even WHO knows about that. Well, if that wasn't the case, they would be using this vaccine in those countries where polio still exists. No, over there they're using OPV because OPV is supposed to generate mucosal antibodies that are supposed to prevent the spread and infection of infection, but IPV only creates serum antibodies, and so one can still acquire a poliovirus and shed it and transmit it to the next person. Now, an interesting thing about IPV is that it was used in this country for the last 20 years or more, and with a vaccine that does not prevent transmission, we cannot talk about herd immunity at all. It's just impossible to have a vaccine creating herd immunity if it does not prevent transmission. So basically, in the last 2 decades or more, we do not have herd immunity, right? And where is polio? There wasn't a single case of polio. So it looks like herd immunity is not always necessary to prevent an outbreak of infection. Okay, let's now go to the next set of vaccines, which are live attenuated vaccines, such as MMR and varicella. And we heard so much about varicella today that I will not cover that, and I will focus on MMR. And the relevant question here is, well, first of all, let me back up a little bit to say that live attenuated vaccines are considered to be much better working vaccines than inactivated vaccines, that they are the ones that that are designed to prevent not only symptoms but also transmission and also create lifelong immunity, which I already know is not the case. But let's re-examine this question. Does prevention of clinical disease symptoms by live attenuated vaccines always mean prevention of transmission, or are there a situation where one comes without another? So let's first look at MMR effectiveness against disease symptoms to start with. And this comes from Cochrane database of systematic reviews, which is a respected body of reviewers. We are no longer going to the CDC for this information, right, in this group. So this is what they say. They look at the literature, and they say that one dose of MMR is 95% effective in preventing clinical measles. That sounds good, so let's move to the next component. One dose of MMR is 64 to 66% effective, and 2 doses are 83 to 88% effective in preventing laboratory-confirmed mumps. Well, wasn't that supposed to be also 95% effective? Or was there some rabbit blood involved in some experiments? Anyway, so now we have these 2 vaccines with very drastic difference in their effectiveness clumped together into one. And you cannot receive one but not the other based on your concern of ineffectiveness and taking additional risks for no good reason. And finally, this is what really surprised me, that there are no studies available to assess the effectiveness of MMR against rubella. Well, and I thought that if a vaccine is approved by FDA, then at least there should be some effectiveness done on it. And well, Cochrane database tells us it hasn't been done. So the only thing that we can really work with and discuss is really this, because this is not enough to create herd immunity even according to conventional standards. So let's re-examine clinical measles. And why I am stressing this, the clinical measles. Is there another type of measles? Is there anything other than clinical measles? Yes. There are actually at least 2 types of measles, maybe more. There is clinical measles and there is modified measles. Modified measles only happens in vaccinated people. Now, so how are clinical measles and modified measles different? So there was a good study done back in the 90s. There was an outbreak of measles in a pretty much fully vaccinated Boston University. And they captured serum samples from the students right before the outbreak and then after the outbreak to see who got measles, who was exposed to measles, who developed symptoms, who didn't. And what transpired was very interesting results. So there were a few students, maybe 8 of them, who, despite prior vaccination, developed full-blown clinical measles. And when they looked at pre-exposure titers in these students, they were below a certain threshold, which was 120 units. But there was a whole bunch of other students, actually many more, who developed symptoms that didn't quite look like measles. They looked like a flu-like disease, runny nose, cough, fever, headache, photophobia, which is more like measles, or diarrhea, but they didn't have rash. So, and what else they had serological evidence that they were infected with the measles virus rather than with some unrelated virus, I guess. So, the serological range for them for their pre-exposure measles titers was above 120 and below 1,000 units. And I'm just mentioning these numbers because they will be relevant for the next slide. But here we have two different diseases as they appear to a clinician. One, which is clinical measles, it is reportable. Modified measles is not considered a reportable disease, so it is under the radar. We don't know how many people have modified measles, and maybe modified measles is a lesser disease. But if someone carries a virus and is sneezing, coughing, having diarrhea, is there a chance that it may be shed and transmitted to the next person? And we don't really have good studies on that because no one really tracks modified measles. So now let's look at another study which was done involving about a sample of 600 children who were previously vaccinated with MMR, and at the time of the study, this was their second MMR shot at the age of 5, approximately. And then their titers were tested for the next 10 years. So we have a longitudinal study. And so what the study found is that the titers spike right after this booster, as expected, but then they rapidly go down, and they continue to drop. And there are obviously different groups of children who respond. Some respond better, some respond not as good, but eventually they kind of all go down. And this is this 1,000 threshold, 1,000 units, which, as we know from the previous study, defines the susceptibility to modified measles. Now, these children, even if they get measles, they might not experience the symptoms, so nobody even know that they have measles in their system. Now, let's think about it from SB277 perspective. Let's say this is a classroom of students. Everybody is vaccinated. This is when they're 5 years old. 2 years later, when they're 7 years old, 50% of them, because these are quartiles, so this is 25%, the next 25, the next 25, the next 25. So now already 50% of elementary students are susceptible to modified measles. And what if there is an immunocompromised person among them? Now, by the end of high school, 75% of the classroom becomes susceptible to modified measles. If there is no outbreak and there is no virus in school, it doesn't matter because there is just a susceptibility. But if there is an outbreak, this kind of situation, which is created by SB277, creates a really false sense of security. Well, and I guess that false sense of security was always there. Okay. Now, so I would like to summarize what kind of vaccine policy we currently have. So vaccines currently mandated for school attendance are aimed at preventing diseases that are either non-contagious, such as tetanus, or do not spread easily in a school setting, such as hepatitis B, are not capable of preventing transmission of infection, that would refer to diphtheria, pertussis, and polio, have not been studied for clinical effectiveness against the disease, which is rubella, are not efficacious enough to impart the required threshold of herd immunity, which is mumps, are not durable enough to ensure long-term protection of the majority of vaccinated students from developing a modified form of the disease, such as measles, and are not utilized by some other developed countries for mass vaccination, such as chickenpox. So maybe other countries know something more than we know about chickenpox, that they're not mandating it. So if you look at it this way, you see how unreasonable this policy is. It is not grounded. It's not grounded in medical ethics. It is not grounded in understanding of what vaccines can and cannot achieve. And this law must go. Now, for whose sake are we sacrificing personal liberties in vaccination? Because there is always this big question, well, there are these children who cannot be vaccinated, the immunocompromised. And who are exactly those children who cannot be vaccinated or at least passively immunized with immune globulin after exposure per CDC guidelines? Are there any individuals like that? And this is straight from the CDC. Killed or inactivated vaccines do not represent a danger to immunocompromised persons and generally should be administered as recommended for healthy persons. And most of vaccines are inactivated or killed vaccines that we have on the mandated schedule. Now, with respect to live vaccines, such as MMR, they should not be administered to severely immunocompromised persons. We know why, because compromised immune system cannot handle or deal with even attenuated live viruses. But there is a solution for immunocompromised persons. IG, immunoglobulin, is indicated to prevent measles following exposure. And what is immunoglobulin? Historically, the use of immunoglobulin predated the use of vaccines, and so if someone who is a susceptible segment of population that got exposed to measles, if they receive immunoglobulin rapidly after post-exposure, that prevents or ameliorates disease and saves their lives. So, in fact, pretty much everyone, according to the CDC, can be vaccinated. So who is that hypothetical person for whose sake we are sacrificing our liberties? Now, let's look at herd immunity and where this concept comes from. And I would like to discuss how natural acquired immunity versus vaccine immunity, especially with respect to the difference in levels and duration of protective serum titers. What herd immunity looked in pre-vaccine era and what it could or could not achieve. And finally, vaccine herd immunity in early vaccine era versus post-elimination era, which is now, when endemic measles has been eliminated and we only have imported outbreaks. Protective titers for measles in the vaccinated versus natural immune have been tested by Japanese scientists. And what they found is that vaccinated group had 9-fold lower virus neutralizing serum titers compared to the naturally immune group. Elders, however, that were naturally immune retained high virus neutralizing titers comparable to youngsters who recently had their measles. And this is already a familiar slide from the previous study, which shows that if you have a vaccine, so let's look first at the titers. So the titers are somewhere in the highest probably 5,000 range. Well, multiply that by 9 to see how much it would be in the natural immune. It would shoot through the roof, the titers. So, and here we have a pretty considerable decline. So this decline, these students were only followed for 10 years, so they're 15 years old here. And at this time point, 5% of them already were below 120 units, meaning they are already susceptible to full-blown measles, and I probably was one among them because that's what I got. But then, life doesn't stop at the age of 15, then you go to 25, 35, 45, and so even those who are high responders, at some point their titers may also wane, and that's not really a good news for them because then they become susceptible to measles later on in life, in the adulthood, and we already see that happening. If you look at the Disneyland outbreak, who were the majority of measles cases by age? They were adults. That never happened in pre-vaccine era. So this is another indication that vaccine immunity is waning. And that is a problem because it shifts measles risk into adulthood. And the second problem about that is that waning nature of vaccine immunity precludes rapid eradication of the virus, the way it was expected to be achieved by authorities in the 60s. So we've heard about natural herd immunity, and that also became a buzzword, and sometimes it is used incorrectly. So let's look at that. how herd immunity looked in pre-vaccine era. This comes from the study by Hedrich, who studied measles outbreaks in Baltimore. And this, he started his studies in or actually before 1900, and he carried them out for 30 years. What is plotted here are number of children under the age of 15 who got involved in the measles outbreak. So these are measles outbreaks that are happening. And as you see, there is some periodicity to that. So let's understand why there is a periodicity, why there is not just the constant measles going on like that. So it turns out that the periodicity of measles is related to the rates of non-immune children that are still left in that community. And what it means by non-immune, since there were no vaccines back then, you are either immune because you already had disease or you're still non-immune. And he's only looking at the age under the age of 15 because beyond that age, everyone was immune. And you see fluctuations which kind of correspond with these peaks and valleys. So what he found that probably when non-immunes reach a certain level, then it creates a possibility for an outbreak. And then the outbreak converts those non-immunes into immunes, and now you have herd immunity. And that's why you don't have an outbreak for the next few years, because it takes some time for the elderly to pass away and for newborns to then contribute to the pool of non-immunes, and the whole system resets itself. So it's like a yin and yang, it's going back and forth. So, so with natural herd immunity, you could not eradicate disease. You could only space out the outbreaks. But that was the basis, a starting point upon which the same our friends Sensor and Langmuir decided that they're going to take that, and instead of waiting until the next outbreak occurs, they're going to now come in with their vaccines into community and vaccinate children who are not yet immune. And they thought that, that would be lifelong immunity. And so that would prevent the next outbreak, and maybe possibly the next outbreak and the next outbreak. And because measles virus is a human virus, there is no other reservoir of measles virus in the world, in nature, because there would be no natural host that is still susceptible to measles infection. They thought, for that reason, and probably it was a reasonable assumption, that the measles would be eradicated really rapidly by 1967, and that would be just with one shot in the childhood. So let's see how that turned out. And before we see that, I would like to mention a paper that seems to give credibility to their expectation. So let's examine that. So this is a kind of a famous natural experiment where there was a town, Texarkana, which crosses the border between Texas and Arkansas. And one part of the town didn't have mass vaccination campaign, another one did have vaccination campaign. And so here the level of immunity was 57%, which was composed of all the adults that were already, no, actually what they say, sorry, I would like to correct myself. So 57% was referring to children between age 1 and 9. So obviously these children already had measles, therefore they were immune. And here the level of immunity was 95%, meaning probably 57% of natural immune, and the rest were vaccinated, up to 95% of total immunity. So now measles outbreaks comes to town. The town which had no mass vaccination campaign got a pretty huge outbreak, 606 cases, whereas this side of the town got only 27 cases. So that seems like a reasonable demonstration that mass vaccination works. By the way, all these cases were vaccine failures. They happen in vaccinated children. And there is no such thing as natural immunity failure because no one gets measles twice. So, so that seems like this was back in the 70s, and that was going well along with the theory of mass vaccination creating herd immunity and limiting the outbreak. And then, so mass vaccination was brought to more and more communities. And as we know, the expectation was that they would eradicate measles in 1967, and it looked like they could have done it based on this trend. But it started as a sprint and turned into a marathon, and we are nowhere near eradicating measles from the United States until it was declared eliminated in 2000. And that was done by also putting a second MMR on the schedule. So something just doesn't add up with the prediction, which was based on the assumption of lifelong immunity. And now we know that vaccine doesn't give you ever lifelong immunity, it gives you temporary immunity. And because of that miscalculation, we got such a very different duration of this particular elimination campaign. Now, what's happening now? I would like to compare two outbreaks that happened in Canada. In 2014, post-elimination era, both in Canada and the United States, there was an outbreak of measles in a religious non-vaccinating community in Fraser Valley. It was a huge outbreak. 433 cases, pretty much everyone was unvaccinated. How surprising. Wow, so that's this an indication why we have to follow the guidelines and not skip our vaccines, right? Because if we vaccinated all these people, then there wouldn't be any outbreak, right? And wrong, because in 2011, there was an outbreak of measles in a vaccine-compliant community in Quebec of similar size. And so let's read about it a little bit. So this comes from this publication. The affected community had 95 to 97% childhood vaccination coverage for measles and no concentrated pockets of unvaccinated groups. This was imported by a high school teacher, himself vaccinated for measles in his childhood. This single importation affected more than 678 people, starting with the high school students, and then it leaked into the community. And the overall contribution of twice vaccinated individuals constituted 48% of measles cases, but this was not reflected in the official Canadian statistics. It was only picked up by active surveillance of measles cases. So officially, what they say about this outbreak, that 80% of the outbreak was due to unvaccinated, undervaccinated, or those with unknown vaccination status. That's how they spin it in mainstream media. So still they're somehow blaming it on vaccinated. But here what we have a community which is fully vaccinated pretty much. I can't believe this can get any higher than that. You have to put in their children under 1 year of age that are not even due for vaccination, a certain percent there. So right now, when it's post-elimination era, it doesn't seem to matter whether you have a fully compliant community or completely unvaccinated community. The magnitude of the outbreak is going to be the same. What's happening? And this is just a comparison. In the 70s, mass vaccination seemed to work in reducing the outbreak size. Right now, in post-elimination era, it doesn't work anymore. Let's try to find an explanation to this. So in the early stages of the measles eradication campaign, the required herd immunity threshold could be easily achieved by vaccinating a very small fraction of yet non-immune children. Remember, 50% of children were already immune. You only needed to go with like 45% more to catch those with vaccines, and then you would reach your threshold of immunity, and all adults were already immune. But now, the further we go away from the beginning of the vaccination campaign, we have the proportion of individuals with permanent naturally acquired immunity is being reduced. And vaccination alone cannot sustain the required herd immunity threshold because of the waning nature of vaccine immunity, and that puts everything upside down. So I would like to show you my representation of herd immunity as an iceberg. So what we had in pre-vaccine era, before an outbreak, we would have the bottom of the iceberg that would represent all the immune adults. And just we needed this a little bit more that would be achieved during the outbreak to convert community to having herd immunity. So then you have the whole herd immunity effect. Now what we have pretty much eliminated this bottom part of the iceberg. All these adults who were previously naturally immune are now being substituted with younger adults who were vaccinated in their childhood, but right now they're either susceptible to modified measles, and more of them are being susceptible to clinical measles. And what we are doing, we are just trying to vaccinate just this little percent, pretty much our children, yeah? And it's like putting fake snow on top of the ocean and pretending that there is an iceberg below. So it looks like we have reached global warming in herd immunity. Okay, I think we will stop on this humorous note, but I would like to say that even though SB 277 is a draconian law and it shouldn't be here, but while it is here, it is accomplishing something positive in that it is uniting doctors and making doctors start researching vaccine risks and vaccine lack of effectiveness in some cases, and be on the side of the patient. Thank you.